So today on Worldwide Entertainment TV, we have the accomplished Dr. Amara Pope that's going to give us some insight about what she has researched about the Canadian music business. So I see that you are Trinidadian Canadian
Yes,
or
correct.
Trinidadian.
My parents were born in Trinidad, but I was born in Canada.
Yeah. My dad was born in Trinidad. He
Hmm.
grew up in Grenada. My mom was born in Grenada, and then she met him in Trinidad. So
Oh,
it's my Trinidadian connection.
you have them Trini roots as well.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
So could you tell us more about your background, how and how it led to you receiving a PhD?
Yes, of course. Well, as you mentioned, my parents are from Trinidad, and I was born and raised in Canada. And I was born in Scarborough, Ontario, where I was surrounded by many other Caribbean immigrants and immigrants from all around the world. It was a great experience, very diverse, very multicultural. And when I was in about grade two, my parents moved our family from Scarborough to Elmira. And Elmira is a very small town. We were known as the Brown family in the corner house. I was the only brown girl in school. So it was very different from growing up in Scarborough. And that's when I really noticed my differences from those around me and differences from also what Canadian media and Canadian music was airing at the time. And I was heavily intrigued by R&B music, by reggae, by soca, by calypso. And then I found that mainstream media in Canada didn't tend to play that kind of music or air those kind of individuals creating that type of music on television. And so television radio didn't really reflect the cultural environment that I grew up in at home, neither did kind of my external surroundings outside of my home. And that interest, I didn't know later down the line would heavily influence my academic studies. So I've always been interested in different forms of communication as well as racial and national identities. And I kind of coupled those ideas by exploring the representation of Canadian music in mainstream media. And I found that Canadian R&B was heavily underrepresented. While I dove into the research in my PhD, a lot of Canadian R&B artists were immigrants that came to Canada and struggled to get representation, to get access to airwaves, as well as support in Canadian music. So a lot of them moved to the US to get that support they needed to then come back and be celebrated in Canada. And while I was conducting my research, I kind of put and parsed together a working history of Canadian R&B. I call it an episodic history because I found it was heavily undocumented in Canadian academia, as well as I said, underrepresented in media. So I took a stab at kind of the working history of Canadian R&B since it wasn't really there. But the main focus originally was looking at Drake, Justin Bieber, and Jessie Reyes and looking at their different approaches to branding themselves as Canadian. They did it in different ways. I argue Justin Bieber represents the Great White North traditional aspects of Canada. Drake represents the multicultural Canada I experienced in Scarborough. And Jessie Reyes represents that second generation immigrant struggle. So I had to look at that history of Canadian R&B before I then looked at what contemporary artists are doing in the space.
Yeah. Okay.
Mhm.
So while you're doing your research, did you see like the past history of artists such as Julie Black?
Yes.
Uh,
Yeah, I talk about Julie
yeah,
Black. I talk about Crack of Dawn. I talk about Maestro Fresh West. I talk about Michi Me. I talk about Cardinal Official, many artists. And I talk
yeah,
about them over, hip hop and R&B. And I discuss how they kind of work together in the periphery of society, create what I call contemporary R&B, which is a mix of those different cultural identities as well as hip hop, rap, soca,
yeah.
reggae. Yeah.
So do you think with the advent of the internet, it opened up a different lane for the artists in Canada to propel? How would you say the artists before them had their difficulties overcome with the mainstream? Because I know back then it was only like a one, two artists that would like get the accolades.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Underground was like non-existent, although it was there.
mm-hmm. And that's something I discussed in my dissertation. When I talk about Justin Bieber, Drake, and Jessie Reyez, I group them in a new generation of Canadian R&B. Well, two new generations. I put Drake and Justin Bieber in the second generation and Reyes in the third. But I kind of overgeneralize all of the artists pre-internet. As you mentioned, the internet really changed the space and gave artists access to audiences, to networks, to resources that the artists before the internet didn't really have access to. I talk about how many artists had to jump over and go to the US to get that support before getting that recognition here. But what I tend to argue is it's also kind of a story or narrative of hope, because what these artists did was they pooled their money, they worked together to perform, to collaborate, to produce their own music and press their own CDs that they then exported to all around the world. And that was pre-internet. And although they didn't have the support nationally from a lot of the traditional gatekeepers in the music industry, they still band together to really create that awareness of Canadian R&B music, which I argue is, again, hip hop, reggae, soca kind of blended into, and traditional R&B blended into one. And they created songs like Northern Touch, for example, but with the Rascals, all of these different identities band together. And so I argue that, Drake, Justin Bieber, and Jessie Reyez are new generations that built on the backs and the networks and the work that these artists did before the internet, and then could then amplify their visibility and their sound through social media.
Okay, so what is your thought on the impact of Drake? Because you not only made an impact in Toronto and Canada, he also impacted the trends in America. So
Mm-hmm.
what did he do that was so different from any others that was before him from up north?
Yeah. Well, I debunk the myth that he completely did it on his own pre-signing with a music label. In my dissertation, I talk about how he built those networks before signing. He was on tour with Lil Wayne before he signed a record deal. He established his online presence by building on the work of his television career. He had a local audience from Degrassi. He also performed locally in Toronto before then moving to the States. So he had an established network prior to signing. And then he also had the amplification of social media. And what I argue in this dissertation for my PhD, also in my master's degree and previous studies, is that Drake really knew how to market himself through social media. And I think that his skill in both performance as well as in marketing really helped to amplify his image. And I preface that by saying he definitely still built on the backs of artists before him who gave him free studio time, again, relationships, and artists like Cardinal who had been repping Canada in the States even before Drake did. So there was that awareness already there, but Drake then kind of built upon it and used his marketing skills to really amplify his visibility.
Okay, so what do you think about social media and blogs and podcasts? Do you think that also help artists that wouldn't be known, or for fans to realize the background of these artists? Do
Yes, and
you think that had an impact?
definitely. And I talk about Drake, Justin Bieber, and Jessie Reyez all using social media platforms to build their audience prior to signing with a music label. And all three artists use different platforms. Drake used Blogspot, he used MySpace. Justin Bieber used YouTube. Jessie Reyez used Facebook and YouTube as well, all to kind of generate that awareness. And what they did too in building that audience is they attracted the right people. It's key individuals that then help them catapult their careers. So I think it's really important that artists use the online space to the best of their abilities, not just to generate an audience, but also to get in front of those key people.
So what would you say to some critics that believe that Drake hasn't given enough back to the city in terms of the local artists? Although people could argue and say that he's helped the exposure of Pressa, Top Five, and artists of that ilk.
And The Weeknd, Party Next Door. I think he's definitely helped to establish artists locally. He's also helped Jesse Reyes and worked with Jesse Reyes. They actually had a song that was leaked and was actually unofficially released. If you look it up online, you'll see he's worked with Justin Bieber early in their careers. They had a single together. And it was off of Justin Bieber's album, actually. And so I do believe he has helped artists locally. In terms of the extent to what he's done, he's also helped open up history, which has brought in a lot of artists, both locally and internationally, to create this and flourish the music space in Canada and reinvigorate it in ways that artists weren't able to do before with the access that he has. So I would argue that he does help kind of catapult and reinvigorate the music industry here. But to critics who say that he's not done enough, I think it just depends on pure opinion, whether he's working on establishing his career and and he's an entrepreneur, he's not just working in the music industry now. He's working with so many brand partnerships, merchandising. So I would say he's continuing to expand his career right now while still in his different ways, building back and giving back to the community. He, with the OVO branded shirts and sweaters that represented cities in Ontario. And I think that was really important too, because he's just further amplifying what it is that we have here and what the cities are and what the music vibe really is.
So you also speak about the missing history of the R&B scene.
Mm-hmm.
Could you touch upon what do you mean by that?
Yeah, as I previously mentioned, the artists were heavily under represented in Canadian media, and that included, the radio, television. Even when we created our first music awards magazine and show, the Juno, which eventually became the Junos, they didn't air artists or even include artists in hip hop, R&B, or music traditionally associated with Black identities for a very long time. They didn't, and when they did include those awards, they aired them during commercial breaks for a very long time as well. So that really exemplifies the lack of support that the music industry had in Canada for artists that were considered participating in genres quote unquote Black. We preferenced white folk and rock artists and country artists heavily in Canada to represent our national sound, despite so much of these artists in blues and jazz and folk, not folk, in blues and jazz and R&B, soca, reggae, hip hop. So I argue that when I was conducting this research, academia tends to focus when it talks about Canadian music in the rock and folk genres, as well as country genres, rather than focus on these artists who were many immigrants participating in the music space, but weren't given as much visibility on mainstream media.
Yes, I agree, because I have personal experiences. Like, for instance, as you brought up the soca.
Mm-hmm.
My dad was actually nominated for a Juno in 1983, but because I guess their lack of understanding the different genres, they have categorized this song as a reggae song. So he was nominated in the reggae. And I also know that sometimes management and agents would try to put their artists in different categories, knowing that the hip hop was not really like covered for exposure. But I don't know how it is in 2023 and 2024. If you have seen a change or like a move to a change to like be more inclusive and include people who understand the music.
Yeah, and I actually argue in the dissertation that we're still struggling with how we categorize artists in different genres. Justin Bieber, for example, says that his album Changes was R&B, but Grammys classified his album as pop. And Drake has talked about Hotline Bling being a pop single, but it was pushed into what was quote unquote Black music because of his identity. So this problem continues today based on these racial divides in the music genre. and it persists. We are seeing changes now, but we had trouble with the term urban in 2020, where many music companies decided to strip that from their verbiage because of its association with Black identities. And that was used up until, like I said, 2020. Republic Records made a public statement that they're not going to be using that term, but that just goes to show, that it continues today.
Oh, I didn't know about that.
Hmm.
Do you think sometimes, because you said you looked into hip hop, R&B, soca, do you think sometimes some of the content probably scares off people who don't understand the music and then they create a blanket opinion on Black music in general, like some of the street rap and things of that nature?
Well, the biggest argument I make about what Canadian R&B exemplifies, it's our representative of our diversity. And I
Yeah.
think that Canadian R&B right now is a great way, the way we see contemporary Canadian R&B, it's a great way to see different identities, cultures, styles kind of working together, or even just working in different parts of the genre. So I would argue that in a sense can help create the lack of, or just, I guess, destroy the barrier that was originally there for a very long time when it came to what R&B music was. We're seeing so many diverse identities represented in the space. So I think what we're seeing right now with Canadian R&B, it's a great way to kind of overcome those traditional notions or prejudice that people had towards different genres.
So what do you think upcoming artists could do to not have the same issues or struggles that artists in the past had before Drake kind of exposed the city
In terms of genre categories or just in building their careers?
in building their careers?
I think the best thing that I've learned from exploring how Bieber, Drake, and Reyes each broke into the industry is understanding that they made the right relationships with key individuals and kind of narrowing their relationships to specific individuals that could help catapult their careers. And, Jesse Reyes worked with Mauricio Ruiz. Justin Bieber worked with Scooter Braun. Drake worked with many artists, actually, but originally worked with Jazz Prince. And knowing that those individuals they worked with were eager to build talent, and then that talent, Drake, Bieber, and Reyes, were eager to break in, it just became a great synergy. So I think that's super important, knowing at least one key individual that could help catapult your career.
Okay. So who do you consider to be, in terms of key components in the music industry here for artists to get in contact with? Because I know it's a little different for the labels in America. Like, suppose Sony in America is different from Sony Canada. It's not, because a lot of artists believe if they sign with Sony, they're going to be getting the same kind of push and everything. But until they realize it's two different, like, what's the word? It's like two different entities.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Because I know Cardinal is A&R for one of the labels up here,
Right.
but I've seen that he's gone different countries looking for artists, and it confuses some of the local artists, which
Mm-hmm,
sometimes causes them to lash out at the guys that are in position.
mm-hmm.
So I don't know if you have any idea on like what could be restrictions for people that have position to explain to artists why there's the same restriction that you were saying that the exposure happens.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that?
Well, I personally am not in a position of power in the music industry to
Yeah.
speak on behalf of them, but I would say that the biggest, as I mentioned in my previous answer, the biggest takeaway is that you find key individuals because Scooter Braun wasn't signed with a major record label when he met Justin Bieber. He worked for music companies before, but at the time of their meeting, he was trying to build it on his own. Mauricio Ruiz was trying to build artists on his own, and Jazz Prince, he had ties to his father working in the industry, but he himself wanted to establish his own name. So I think finding key individuals who don't necessarily need to be in the industry, but are established in the industry yet, but have that hunger for it. If you both have that synergy, you can potentially break in and make it. But you need those individuals, although they might not be with a specific label, have the connections to help you. And that could be in terms of just marketing, getting your music on the radio, or just finding the right people to help you get signed.
Okay, because that leads me into the next question. That do you feel it's a little less pressure on artists to wanting to get signed with the major labels now that the internet is there and the artists can reach the listeners through their smartphones and everything now and computers? Do you
I
see
think
do you see it getting easier, or do you see the same problems arising where the record companies want to take back control of that, if it's possible?
Yeah, I think it really just depends on what the artist is looking for, because if you have the network and you're trying to commodify your music and build your brand, and you can do that on your own, that's amazing. But a lot of artists are limited to who they know, and that might not be enough to commodify their music to create, the larger industry participation they want to have without those connections that a label can offer them. So I think it just really depends. At the end of the day, if you have enough power and money to be able to do it on your own, that's great. But sometimes you need that amplification that the industry can give you by signing with a label. So it just depends. It depends on what you're looking for. Some artists just want to go and play their music without commodifying it, and it's a hobby for them. Some of them want to turn a career into it. So it really just depends on what you want to do with your career.
So speaking of careers, is there anything that you would like the viewers to know that you have coming up, or what to look out from you in the future?
Well, in terms of my career, I've been in the marketing industry for 10 plus years now. And now that I've finished my PhD, the academic stuff has been great. So I have that great industry knowledge, the academic knowledge, and I'm turning that right now into public speaking opportunities. I love sharing the knowledge that I have and making that knowledge accessible. So my PhD, if you want to download it, it's for free, available on my website, all 405 pages of it if you want to go through it, or the 30-minute presentation. One of the things I've learned from my experiences is that you shouldn't gatekeep knowledge, especially when knowing that R&B history was so underrepresented. It would be kind of counterintuitive if I created a blockade from that information that I gathered. So that's available, and I'm just very much excited to be speaking about what I've learned over the last few years in marketing, in exploring racial identities, and exploring music and national identities as well.
Okay. So is there any music that you look forward to this year from any artists you expect?
To be honest, I just am really excited to see how the R&B space continues to develop for Canada. I think that there's a lot of different voices represented, a lot of different immigrants participating in the space, and I just can't wait to see what we do and what we can hear and experience this year.
Okay.
Mhm.
Thanks for the interview and giving us your knowledge on what you researched and some of the advice you gave for upcoming artists that are watching this.
Happy to.
Is there anything else you would like to add before we finish?
Yeah, I mean, if anyone wants to reach out to me, they can check my Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. It's the same handle, DRAMARAPOPE, so Dr. Amara Pope, or just visit my website is www.dramarapope.ca.